Without Feet by H.G. Wells is a story about a scientist named Griffin. He discovers a rare chemical which can make a man invisible, but at the same time, the man can be touched and felt physically. Let's read and find out how he uses or misuses his powers of his own. The two boys started in surprise at the fresh, muddy imprints of a pair of bare feet. What was a barefooted man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London? And where was the man? As they gazed, a remarkable sight met their eyes. A fresh footmark appeared from nowhere. Further, footprints followed, one after another, descending the steps and progressing down the street. The boys followed, fascinated, until the muddy impressions became fainter and fainter, and at last disappeared altogether. The explanation of the mystery was really simple enough. The bewildered boys had been following a scientist who had just discovered how to make the human body transparent. Griffin, the scientist, had carried out experiment after experiment to prove that the human body could become invisible. Finally, he swallowed certain rare drugs and his body became as transparent as a sheet of glass, though it also remained as solid as glass. Two boys suddenly noticed a few muddy imprints of bare feet, and they started wondering that what was a barefoot man doing on the steps of a house in the middle of London. And they also started thinking that whether there was a man as nowhere to be seen. And then they suddenly saw another footmark. The man was still not visible. They started following the footprints. They followed them until the footprints became invisible. They had been following a scientist who had discovered how to make the human body transparent or invisible. And the scientist was Griffin, who had been working for a long time to see how to make the human body invisible. Suddenly one day he consumed certain drugs which made his body invisible, though it could be felt. Brilliant scientist though he was, Griffin was rather a lawless person. His landlord asked him and tried to eject him. In revenge, Griffin set fire to the house. To get away without being seen, he had to remove his clothes. Thus it was that he became a homeless wanderer, without clothes, without money, and quite invisible, until he happened to step in some mud and left footprints as he walked. Here we can see that the scientist Griffin was a lawless person. And one day what he had done, he burned down the house of his landlord who was trying to throw him out of his house. And then, as he wanted to be invisible, he had to remove his clothes and then roam around without clothes and without money. His presence was felt after he stepped in some mud and his footprints could be seen as he walked. He escaped easily enough from the boys who followed his footprints in London, but his adventures were by no means over. He had chosen a bad time of the year to wander about London without clothes. It was midwinter, the air was bitterly cold, and he could not do without clothes. Here we can see the scientist Griffin easily escaped the boys who had followed him, but he had many more adventures coming up. He had chosen a bad time to wander in London as it was winter season going on and the air was bitterly cold. Instead of walking about the streets, he decided to slip into a big London store for warmth. Closing time arrived, and as soon as the doors were shut, Griffin was able to give himself the pleasure of clothing and feeding himself without regard to expense. He broke open boxes and wrappers and fitted himself out with warm clothes. Soon, with shoes, an overcoat, and a wide brimmed hat, he became a fully dressed and visible person. In the kitchen of the restaurant, he found cold meat and coffee, and he followed up the meal with sweets and wine taken from the grocery store. Finally, he settled down to sleep on a pile of quills. If only Griffin had managed to wake up in good time, all might have been well. As it was, he did not wake up until the assistants were already arriving next morning. When he saw a couple of them approaching, he panicked and began to run. They naturally gave chase. In the end, he was able to escape only by quickly taking off his newly found clothes. So once more he found himself invisible but naked in the chill January air. So we knew that during this winter season he was just walking across London nakedly, and he decided to stay inside a store for warmth. As he went inside the store and closing time arrived, the doors of the store were shut and nobody was there inside. He got food to eat and wore new clothes without paying for it. He became visible again as he wore shoes, overcoat and a hat. He then found cold meat and coffee in the kitchen and ate them. After that, he also had sweets and wine from the grocery store. Then he slept on the pile of quills kept nearby and could not wake up on time. Next morning, when the assistants came and started approaching him, he became nervous and started running away. Then obviously the assistants started chasing him as well. And he escaped only because he quickly removed his new clothes. Again he was invisible and naked without any money in the chill air of January.